Thank you everyone for joining in this very important discussion using geospatial as a form of tackling the climate change crisis and as form of solution for disaster management, for readiness mechanism, for prevention of hazard. As we all know that currently this is the flooding season due to the raining season that we have here in Nigeria and other parts of the world that are faced with extreme weather events. And here we have one of those technology or tools that we can use to solve the climate change crisis. So we don't have to wait until when we have all of these tools or technology before we can start acting on the climate change crisis. The ones we use now, we can deploy them, we can utilize them while we keep trying to bring more innovations and technology that we enhance our environment sustainably. And one of those tools is the geospatial, of which I have with me today an important guest, Taiwo Ogunwumi, and he's an environmental and a geospatial consultant, and is going to tell us more about what this is all about. So it's a very viable tool that we can use for food security, for climate, to solve the climate change crisis, to do several kind of things that we can find around us. And he's going to tell us more. It's up to you now to introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adenike. I really appreciate to be here today. It's a privilege to meet everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Taiwo Ogunwumi. I'm an environmental researcher. I'm a geospatial consultant, and I'm here today to discuss one of the most essential, of using geospatial technology to address the current climate change crisis, and at the same time, to be able to use it to address disaster risks that we have all over the world, most especially in the developing country, specifically West Africa.
Thank you so much. So today you share with us, you help us like an insight into the geospatial, like we have different areas. How can we utilize this to boost the our environmental immune system? Because right now it's really down. Like we are getting to extreme crisis happening around the world. So how can we use these tools or technology to help boost our environmental immune?
Thank you very much. I will just go a little bit elementary so that for the people who doesn't understand what geospatial technology is all about, so they could be able to have a very little insight. And when I mean geographical information system, is a computerized system that is capable of collecting, recording, that give us room to visualize geographical information. So when we mean geography, we're talking about the earth surface, right? We're talking about the trees, the rock, the water, the river, and buildings and population that we have all around the environment. So GIS has made it more possible for us to be able to have an interaction with these things, to see what is where, to see what is at the left, at the right, just to be able to understand location factor. Many of us use this technology, even though we're not aware about it. You can see you have Google on your phone to manipulate and to see directions. That's one of the very good example of geospatial technology. However, it doesn't end there. We also have remote sensing technology, which is a component of geospatial technology. What does remote sensing do? This is how to do with when you have a satellite imagery in space that give us a big picture of the Earth's surface, that is places that we cannot access. This is very, very good when it comes to recording rainfall. This is very, very good when it comes to recording temperature. And these are one of the key elements of weather, right? That are subcomponent of climate, isn't it? So the power of digital technology is very, very vital in helping us to understand our environment, to understand tree depletion, to understand our biodiversity, to understand the ocean view, to understand the river expansion, which are very, very vital and which are very, very important to human sustainability in space. So that's one of the key things that this software does.
Okay, thank you so much. I really love the way you break it down. And I've seen from your research, right? You talked about slow onset crisis from the climate change crisis and the rapid onset crisis. Like these two things, they have different forms. So how can you break it down? How do we make use of this geospatial for both the slow and the rapid events?
So very, very good. Thanks so much for getting a bit insight to one of my published paper with the Guardian, and which is on understanding climate and slow onset hazard. Slow hazard are hazard that does not happen suddenly, just like the word slow. An example can be drought, desertification, land degradation. This does not come so quick. And another example is sea level rise. It takes time for them to become an hazard, become so slow. In contrast to sudden onset like flood, like cyclone, like hurricane, like earthquake that just happened in the taking of a finger. So you can see, and in this regards, GIS technology make it very easy for us to be able to understand, to predict, not that alone, at the same time to respond to droughts, which is an example of a slow onset hazard. Drought is a situation whereby we have very higher temperature and higher evapotranspiration, and at the same time, low access to water. But it's very, very easy and very, very, a good tool like GIS make it very easy to be able to communicate early warning of drought, and most especially to farmers who are within the agricultural sector, to be able to understand when we have a flood drought, for instance, what is the possibility of having drought? And at the same time, we can also use the technology to be able to assess the impact of drought, which is an example is slow onset hazard. So let's say, for instance, now we have a drought occurrence in a particular location. GIS make it very easy for us to know how many farmers are affected. Remember that here comes the word climate adaptation, that is providing response to those people who might have been affected by drought. In one of my previous papers that I wrote on drought, I suggested that at the event of having a drought, GIS make us to understand we are being affected using some couple of variables like rainfall, like the land surface temperature of that particular zone where drought is being declared. So in this, you can see the power of using that tool to not just to predict, at the same time to respond and assess the impact which this climate-induced, hazard has caused in a particular location or community. At the same time, when you look at the sudden onset hazard, for instance, just like flooding or cyclone, geospatial technology make it very, very easy to predict, such hazard before they occur. You can easily predict excess of rainfall that lead to flood. You can easily predict the amount of rainfall that might happen in a particular place that might subsequently lead to the flooding. And at the same time, when flood occur, let's say, unfortunately, you have flood in a particular location, the power of remote sensing, which is a satellite imagery that capture, that capture picture of the space, that capture from the space, the picture of the Earth surface, it makes it more easy to understand flood impact. So we can be able to know when there was flood, how many houses was affected, how many ecosystem, that is trees, plants, were destroyed by flood. So in this regard, this makes us to be able to make a good response. That is, how do we provide relief to people that lose their houses to the sudden onset hazard like flood, for instance? How do we able to do what we call replantation? Do you get the point now? Don't forget that trees are very, very vital. Vegetation are very, very important. Those are our ecosystem resources. So which can also be destroyed by this sudden onset. So GIS make it to be able for us to be able to understand the impact of any type of sudden onset event on this ecosystem, and it gives us room to begin to do what? To respond too fast, whether we have to replant, or we have to create more possible solution. At the same time, just to go back to the slow onset hazard, the slow onset hazard, for instance, now desertification, geospatial technology and remote sensing make it more easy to know when we are having an increasing desertification in a particular place. So we can be able to know, well, we are losing trees, we're losing bio resources in this particular location. Then there can be what? There can be a very, very good way to make policy to say, okay, in this location now, there's need for more afforestation. Why? Because over the course of the year, there has been deforestation. So you can see that the power of geospatial technology make it easy, not just to assess the slow onset events like droughts and sea level rise, but at the same time, it's very, very essential to also address this sudden onset event like flood or cyclone. Thank you so much.
So I'm wondering that you have just stated the variability of the GIS, which I really learned a lot. And now I want to ask, you mentioned policy. So looking at the case study of Nigeria, specifically Lagos, Kebbi State, and all of these like the Bayelsa states, all of these states that are prone to flooding, what policies do you think we can come up with that could help for people to respond to this, or to bring like a readiness mechanism for people to get ready, for them to know when they are vulnerable or when their plants will be threatened by this flood? So what do you think are the policies?
Very, very essential to address this question. Let us start from background. And when you look at this states you mentioned, we tend to find that these are states that are surrounded by the ocean, right? When you mention Port Harcourt, that is the south part. When you mention Lagos, that's the southwestern part of Nigeria, these are places that are bordered by water. And then these are places that, due to sea level rise and changing the amount of rainfall, have exposed such locations to and higher events of flooding over the year consecutively. And when you look at how can we address this, how can people be better prepared, then I'm probably going to go to the concept of disaster risk management. What is this concept about? It has a component, just 4 components precisely, and that's number 1, preparedness, number 2 is prevention, number 3 is response, and number 4 is recovery. 1 is preparedness, 2 is prevention or mitigation, and the 3rd one is response, and the 4th one is recovery. So whatever policy we want to make or whatever regulation we want to make should follow all these 4 components. Number 1, how can we be prepared for flooding, for instance? Preparedness means the what? People being better informed, early warning information, which you can also be able to achieve through the spatial remote sensing technology to know where do we have flood, where will flood will occur, where is going to be impacted, how many farmland might be exposed to the flooding when it occurs, meaning that we can better prepare through making structural policy, which can be made through the emergency institution, which can be made through the state government. That's number 1. Another very important thing about preparedness is that there should be a very good urban planning policy that can always guide against people building house to places that are very, very close to water zone, or probably policy to ensure that people relocate from locations that have been predicted to experience flood. That's preparedness. Another structural way, for example, drought, for instance, which may affect agricultural farmers who are creating food for the whole nation, is that when there's early warning for drought, policies and regulation can be made to support those farmers, in terms of adaptation and other strategies to improve their resilience through upcoming droughts. Now, when it comes to prevention, right? How do we prevent such thing? How do we prevent the coming of flood? So let's imagine that we have been able to predict that, oh, well, there will be flooding or probably there will be drought. Then here comes, structured regulation or policy or governmental responses to be able to cater for prevention and mitigation. How can we prevent flooding, for instances? There must be a regulation against disposing of waste and drainage, which often mostly block and lead to flooding. It blocks the flow of water and most lead to flooding. If there are good regulation against this, it reduces people dumping waste, not even on the drainage alone, as well as on our oceans. Thirdly, when it comes to respond, there must be a good policy in frame to respond to any type of hazard, whether slow or sudden onset, in those locations you mentioned, and not that alone, as well as in Nigeria, all over. We need to be able to have a good regulation to see how can we have a prompt response to any hazard. There must be an adequate emergency response to cater for the people, response to farmers who have been affected by any type of hazard. There must be a provision made in place, as relief for those people. And the last one is recovery. Recovery. How can people recover from a particular type of hazard, or let me say a particular type of disasters? When they are all this structured in place, the country won't be much affected by any type of climate-induced hazard.
Okay, thank you so much. You've just shed a light on what's the question, all about how we can prepare, looking at the case study of Nigeria, in trying to help to reduce disaster, because these people that are faced with the floods, we have people that lost their lives, their property Even agriculture is being threatened by floods, because once agriculture is threatened, it will affect the nation because it will lead to increase in price, lower quantity, malnutrition, and all. So that leads me to the next question. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they brought a report that was last week on the 9th of August. So I want to look at your own lens from the geospatial. How can we tackle this crisis, the extreme weather events? What do you people have to say about this report and using this lens of geospatial in tackling the crisis?
Number one thing that's very, very possible and which GIS will be able to offer in this regard is, how do we reduce human emission? There are geospatial tools, even through the power of remote sensing, that give us the room to assess pollution. Okay. So it is, we should be able to measure the rate of emissions that goes on across all regions of a particular country. So if we say we want to reduce emission by a particular degree, then definitely, if there are adequate geospatial system in place that allows you in real time, where do we have more of air pollution? This is being practiced in Europe and it's possible within Nigerian context. GIS can give you room to do this. So when we have this, the whole emphasis of how we can minimize emission can be solved. That's point one. Point two is that, the impact of climate change still continue, despite the fact that the whole world is working towards how we can reduce the human contribution to the effect of climate, right? However, more preparedness is very, very essential. So despite the fact that we might not be able to stop the crisis because of what in the years, we have caused actually, but as a matter of fact, every type of hazard is very, very easy to monitor. So when you talk about cyclone or hurricane, or you talk about flooding in coastal zone, for instance, GIS give us room to be able to assess the change in sea level. At the same time, geospatial technology also give us room to be able, like I said earlier, to understand the changing in the amount of rainfall, or probably to predict the change that might happen in the amount of temperature within a particular year. When we are more better prepared, when there are good preparedness and response strategy in place, people will not be affected by any climate crisis. I can tell you. We have what we call disaster, and disaster occur when there are 4 or 3 components. Number one is when there is hazard, when people are vulnerable. Number 3 is when they are exposed. And number 4 is when they lack the coping adaptive capacity. So hazard on its own, there can be flood. Doesn't mean that people will be affected. People will be affected when they are vulnerable, whether as an individual, a farmer, for instance, now, who is farming very, very close to the river, then what do you expect? He's exposed, right? When the river overflows, is going to be flooded. Definitely. A farmer who does not really have a good adaptive strategy, right, to buy a very big land to cultivate a different type of crop, for instance, lack adaptation. So in this case, when there is hazard, definitely it will lead to disaster. So disaster does not just occur. We don't just have climate crisis that affect people. It's only when there's vulnerability and exposure and we are not better prepared that lead to all this turn into climate crisis, that we all start clamoring, oh, is climate. So we can minimize climate, induced events through better predictions, which is very, very possible through the power of geospatial technology, as well as inclusive remote sensing, for instance.
Okay, we have just mentioned that we can use it, for monitoring. And that monitoring is essential, like in this context that we had today, that environmental surveillance, like trying to surveil our environment, looking at the pandemic. What do you people have to say about that? Because I read a report that there are thousands of pandemic, that this is just one of them, the COVID-19. So what do you have to say about geospatial and environmental surveillance that we can use to prevent environmental intrusion or from pandemics or any type of diseases that is going to affect us from due to lack of unsustainable activities.
Thank you so much for this question. And this is very, very insightful question. Essentially, when you look at COVID-19, for instance, in history, they said that one of the factors that bring about this is due to the fact that we are getting our biodiversity resources into extinction. Trees and mangrove right now, they are being destroyed, right? Due to population expansion, due to construction. So as a matter of fact, as animals that's supposed to be in the forest come in to live with us, right? That leads to more biological hazard. And based on what you said right now, that definitely we're still gonna be having more pandemic, right? Which is very important. How can we use this special technology to monitor our environment? Remote sensing make it very easy to measure trees, mangrove, and other ecosystem resources depletion within our environment. Do not forget that when we have more trees in our surrounding, when we conserve our mangrove, we have good air quality, right? When we conserve our mangrove, we are in a very, very good way of what? Of minimizing human contribution to climate-induced events, isn't it?
Yeah.
When we have good geospatial technology in space, it becomes very easy for us at a glance to understand where are we having tree depletion, so that adequate response can be made towards it. Where do we have our forest reserve? Are they improving or they are increasing? So the power of the future to make it easy for us to measure this. If there are adequate real-time measuring of all this, it becomes very easy for us to know whether we are expanding our biodiversity resources or we are depleting them. Do not forget that in the context of depleting them, that's what makes us to be more exposed to drought, more exposed to desertification, more exposed to lose soil nutrients, more exposed to have higher temperature. Eco-based resources like trees and mangrove are very, very essential because they serve as a regulator of air quality. And they try as much as possible to give us a very cool climate. So if we are able to monitor this through GIS and remote sensing, which is very, very possible, which other countries have been putting in place, which I feel if Nigeria could adopt this, then definitely this will give us a very good room to prevent us from future climate-induced events, from future pandemic that might occur.
Thank you so much. So that leads me to my next question. That what is the deployment rate of the GIS? Like, can you just rate like what percentages around the world are using the GIS? Because now from what you have said, GIS is a very viable tool that we can use for several things in preventing climate change, disaster, extreme weather events. So what is the deployment rate around the world, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe? What is the percentage like?
Yes, very good. Despite the fact that the history of GIS, came from the United States, so definitely its expansion goes down to Europe, and there are very, very high percentage of usage in those countries. Africans are trying enough, definitely. I'm a Nigerian. I learned all what I know from my Nigerian university, but unfortunately, the only thing, there are so many skill professionals, there are so many skilled students who have a good skill in remote sensing, who have a good skill in GIS, but unfortunately, because of the fact that many of the institutions in Nigeria, that is government institutions and ministry, does not appraise the use of geospatial technology, this gives us a very, very low, possibility of, assessing the tool, employing the skills of these people. So I would say that the percentage rate of, using geospatial technology in Africa, it's not still, high compared to the other European and Asia countries. So, but there's still more to be done, in as much as when you look at 10 years ago, GIS have not been a great tool. look at the previous year, GIS is a great tool that being used to even to communicate the COVID-19 impact. You get, now we have so many initiatives and organizations making use of GIS, to communicate flood impact. But well, at the same time, we still need to do more. Each and every state to have a geospatial database, whether for land, whether for transport, whether for forest reserve, there must be a GIS department. You get, until when we have this across office. When you look at United States, for instance, each local government themselves have a geospatial department, that are being used to monitor their ecosystem, resources, that's being used to assess their transport, that are being used to assess, so many key sectors. Urban planning, for instance, GIS technology is being used. So in Nigeria, there's still a gap. In other West African countries, there's still a gap in this aspect, which need to be improved more. So hopefully, and I believe that as we have more youths who are very, very good, who are really passionate about studying GIS, geography, remote sensing in general, then definitely we should, hopefully, we should have more, increase in demand of these skills and the usage of it in all the Nigerian sectors.
Thank you so much. I really like the fact that we have to make use of GIS, not only by ministry, like by not just only environment alone that needs it. Agriculture, transport, works and housing, and every other sectors that make up our economy can make use of these tools in order to prepare, like as a preparedness, for any other crisis, and as a checkmate, like a check and balance thing, to check if their activities is disrupting our environment and how they can better adjust or adapt to it. So it's very important. Thank you that you made mention of that, because it's very, very important that we include such tools, we deploy it in our various sectors so that it strengthens, it helps us a lot, because it's one of those tools, like you just mentioned, 10 years ago, it's not like this, but it keeps spreading. So what do you think about 10 years to now? What do you think the geospatial will look like in solving the climate change crisis? And how do you hope we can use it in 10 years time in order for it to build our environmental sustainability, or our environmental immune in tackling the climate change crisis?
Thank you. Now the demand is high. Definitely the whole world have not been able to recognize the fact that there are climate crisis and it's causing major effects, to the population, to the economy. So everybody's looking for solution. A couple of years ago, nobody believed in early warning system. Now they tend to realize that, oh, well, there's need for early warning system. And there have been great improvements, month by month. Most especially within the 2020 and 2021, there have been a very, very great, improvement in use of technology, most especially digital technology within the African countries. However, we can easily be sure that 10 years to come, then definitely we should have more of data science, geospatial technology, machine learning tool that can be used to predict, accurately predict. There should be more of ministries, even the medical sector now would be able by 10 to understand, use GIS within the sector, because the whole COVID-19 pandemic have shown a great impact. Flood crisis comes every time now. So every department, not just the emergency department alone, even the Ministry of Housing now understand the essentiality of having a database of houses to know what are the standard of the house. So that means if my house is not of good standard now, definitely when there's flood, what will happen? Then it will drive it away. Definitely. When people locate to where they're supposed to locate, that is meaning that we can be able to understand, the whole parcels of land using GIS to assign, to make a good urban planning. Hopefully 10 years to come, definitely, everybody in their house will be able to access, flood early warning via their phone, via their internet, or TV. They're supposed to be early warning communication of any type of hazard, precisely. At the same time, there would definitely be, the insurance company, like we have in the United States, for instance, man, the insurance company now, they, as much as possible, work with the GIS specialist to know where it's going to be flooded. And as well, the people themselves also now comes to be able to say, oh, I want to insure my house, I want to insure my property, I want to insure my companies, against flood, against earthquake. So you can see how essential this can be in the next 10 years. So to be positive, I'm so much sure and certain that technology is moving so fast at pace now, and quite well, 10 years to come, will have been more far than this.
Thank you so much. So you talked about data. Data very, very important. Even before we can take policies, before we can make policies, it's very important that we get this data so that we are making the right balanced policies that is going to help for everyone, because you can make policy and it might affect the majority of those people that might not be able to find their way out of it. So just to ask, concerning the Lake Chad crisis, what do you think about geospatial?
Well, if I look at, when it comes to the Lake Chad crisis, GIS is a very good tool to also to examine the issue of insecurity. I mean, generally, one, insecurity and conflict, we have the power of remote sensing helping us to know where we have, terrorism. At the same time, too, when it comes to water crisis, like I said, technology make it easy for us to understand how we have water depletion. At the same time, how to know places that are exposed to farming. So deploying GIS technology in this context, that have several components, like I said earlier, remote sensing, GIS, GPS, and drone, for instance, this is going to be a very good technology to assess such location, despite the fact that there are so many other factors that will be required to respond to Lake Chad crisis. Why I can still say categorically that GIS can still, solve a little in an elementary part of it in assessing the issue of insecurity in this particular location.
Over time, there have been this issue in the Lake Chad basin that the Lake Chad that it's shrinking, and some said it is not shrinking. How can the geospatial use to get the real size? Okay, thank you so much. And that leads me to my next question, talking about how we can use geospatial to know the current status of the Lake Chad, like the size of Lake Chad, because over time there have been several arguments that the lake is shrinking, the lake is balanced, like it's stable. But how do we use that to know the current size of Lake Chad?
For the past 30 years, it has become possible to have a view that is an imagery view of the whole Earth surface. And that comes through the power of remote sensing. Through remote sensing, we can be able to understand how is a particular location 10 years ago, 5 years ago. The remote sensing technology will help us to understand the shrinking or the expansion of Lake Chad. Such imagery can be incorporated into GIS, and through GIS, we can calculate the area, whether there is depletion, whether there is expansion. It's very, very easy. Because why? The remote sensing technology, that is the satellite installed in space, capture the image of the Earth surface all around the year. So whatever is going on the Earth surface when it comes to all these natural features, except the movable one, not like cars or or human being moving. But when it comes to trees, when it comes to river, all this can be captured and we can easily analyze it. So GIS is a very good tool in this context. This can easily solve a lot of disputes. At the same time, we have so many countries also that adopt GIS to understand where they can construct a dam, how they can regulate the water. If GIS can be able to check sea level rise, then definitely it's a very good tool to also assess the Lake Chad, river expansion or reduction, whatever the context in this particular time is very, very possible.
Yeah. So if I get you right, we don't necessarily need to be there before we can know the size, right? Because you just talked about remote sensing. That means we don't just have, we don't necessarily need to be there physically before we can get the size, right?
Exactly.
Which is very, yeah, okay, thank you. Which is very, very important, that we don't need to travel there to get all of those things, which is part of the reason why it's very viable that we can use, in tackling all of this issue. Because I'm very interested in that part, that we need to know the current size of the Lake Chad, so that we could help policy makers in providing their own side of the solution for the government, for the people in general, you know, and we can also know the number of tree covers, right?
Exactly.
Okay, looking at that of the Great Green Wall, we could be able to know how many trees have been planted, right?
Yes, definitely. We can be able
Okay,
to understand, trees that have been planted. You can do tree counting, for instance. You can easily do tree counting through the power of geospatial technology and machine learning. You can do tree counting. You can look at, the expansion of trees. At the same time, you can also monitor depletion in the forest. So you can so there can be a quick policy, there can be a quick mitigation, to stop such in a particular location.
okay, so thank you so much. So what is your advice, or what do you have for people out there, for them to for you to just give us like your regards concerning the geospatial and everything, like to the business people, to governments, to individual and all?
I think without putting so much focus on technology alone, I believe that number one, in order to reduce climate crisis, each and everybody, the youth, the business, the private sector, the government have a quota to contribute in reducing the human impact that results to several types of hazards or climate crisis that we experience within Nigeria and every country in the world. However, we should try as much as possible to make use of the available technology, just like the other countries of the world, in monitoring our environment, in assessing our environment, in mitigating against several upcoming crises. And this is why the power of geospatial technology and remote sensing can be put in place. Government should try as much as possible to regulate institutions and support them in creating an avenue for youth to learn all this technology. At the same time, each and every department, just like you have mentioned, should be equipped enough, most especially the disaster risk emergency department within the country, with the national and the state emergency, for instance, they should be better equipped with all this geospatial tool. This will make the work very easy and to give us the room to have a very, very low occurrence of disaster. Though there can be hazard, that is, but we should try as possible to ensure that they don't lead to disaster. So like I said earlier, hazard is different from disaster. Hazard can occur. It will lead to disaster means that we lost life, we lost property. When an hazard occurs and there's no loss of property, then we don't call it disaster. So we don't see it as a climate crisis. We just see it as an event that occurs. So therefore, I urge everybody individually to plug into the power of this technology, and we should try as much as possible, just like the IPCC report said, we should try as much as possible to reduce human emission to save our planet for the future. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much for that valuable contribution. And yeah, it's very important that we have this knowledge, the training, and so that we could be able to expand how we can use the geospatial in solving issues in our society today, because the climate change crisis is not waiting. So we have to also keep deploying tools that we can help enhance our environment and could help boost the immunity. So thank you so much, Mr. Taiwo. Thank you for your time and thank you for coming today. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.